What does it mean to spike the spiritual? Chapter 2 of Prodigal Press is called Spiking the Spiritual. And before I dive into the content, I should probably explain what it means to spike a story. Back in the day, whenever newspaper editors literally had a little metal spike with a point on it, whenever they wanted to kill a story, they would take the paper that the story was written on and literally put it on that little spike. And that was called spiking a story. It would put it there rather than send it off to the typesetter. We called Chapter 2 in Prodigal Press Spiking the Spiritual because that is often what mainstream editors do to the spiritual dimension of a story. They spike it, or they suppress it, or they kill it. How do they do that? Let me give you a quick example of that. Some years ago, when Superstorm Sandy hit the northeastern United States, it shut down the New York Stock Exchange for a couple of days. And most of the newspaper coverage and mainstream media coverage of that event focused on government entities, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, state and local and city governments. In fact, whenever the New York Stock Exchange opened up again, the folks lining the dais to ring the bell to basically signal to the world that New York was open again for business were all representatives of government agencies. What was ignored in that coverage was the important role that religious people played in helping their neighbors, literally on the ground in those affected areas. And we see this every time that there's a disaster. When Katrina went through New Orleans, when Hurricane Irma went through Florida, whenever Hurricane Harvey went through Texas, it is often the people on the ground, religious organizations, churches, Christians helping their neighbors, that are the first responders in these disasters, but they are often ignored in the coverage by the mainstream media. So ignoring religious people is one way that mainstream journalists spike the spiritual in a story. There is a second way, and that way is that they will use the most unreasonable religious voices in a story. Jim Kuipers in 2002 did a study of 116 newspapers and found that most journalists have a very robust Rolodex when it comes to liberal sources, but a very limited Rolodex when it comes to conservative and Christian voices. And the net effect of that is that whenever conservative voices are used in a story, those conservative voices tend to be the loudest and the most shrill, the only ones for the most part that these liberal journalists have even ever heard of. Whereas the more liberal voices are often nuanced and reasonable because they're being chosen from a much wider variety of sources by the journalist himself. So ignoring the spiritual dimension of a story or selectively choosing shrill voices or unreasonable religious voices to go in a story, those two practices fall under the larger category of framing a story. Framing a story is exactly what it sounds like. Imagine a picture frame. It's what you choose to put in the story versus all the other stuff in the world that is outside of that story. We're going to say more about media framing in a later video, but wanted to just highlight these two aspects today as a way of explaining how mainstream media will spike the spiritual dimensions of a story.